The Unsuspecting Gold Digger by J.T. Lawrence. When I first slept with Byron, I didn't know about the money. I don't think anyone did. They weren't handing out silver spoons the days we were born. His parents were decidedly middle class, as were mine, and while we didn't want for much, we were by no stretch of the imagination trust fund kids. We weren't in line to inherit much either, once our folks eventually decided to leap off their respective mortal coils, which looked as if it would be further and further into the future the way they were soldiering on, making themselves raw green juices for breakfast and embracing meditation and Tai Chi. It's not like I wished them dead, far from it, but I did wonder from time to time how old they would allow themselves to get. It's about being practical. I mean, old age isn't pretty. Letting yourself get any older than 90, I think, isn't respectable. There are plenty of ways you can stop this from happening. It doesn't have to be gruesome. In fact, the whole point is to avoid vulgarity altogether. Byron and I both went to good government schools in Johannesburg. We had nice clothes, but not the best. Good sporting equipment, but not the most expensive. We grew up middle of the road, and although we only met when we were in our mid-30s, we could easily have known each other for years. Because he was exactly like my brothers and the other boys I knew, and I, like his sister. We knew the same jokes and had the same boarding school horror food stories, which we would still exchange in new company 20 years on. In moments like these, it was easy to feel as if we had known each other our whole lives. There was an inherent intimacy in our relationship, something sharp and soft at the same time, embedded deep in our connection with each other. An oyster at the bottom of our ocean. We met online, not on a dating site, but a travel forum, and our relationship developed quickly. There was no playing hard to get on either side. There was no need. We both saw what we wanted and both got lucky. When you're on your way downhill from 35 and you manage to link arms with a fellow slider, who you find reasonably attractive and who makes you laugh, you don't think twice about moving too fast. We were comfortable with each other from the beginning, mature enough to be able to just be ourselves. We had similar interests and a shared love of modern literature, red wine, and any movie starring Will Ferrell. We kind of slid into each other's lives, slid into each other. We ate from each other's plates, split our paperbacks, and shared our socks. We kissed before brushing our teeth. The first warning bell was the size of the diamond he gave me. No, that's not right. The actual warning bell was the diamond itself, and what it represented. The size just magnified the alarm. We had spoken about marriage fleetingly. Byron knew that it wasn't an institution I was particularly fond of, and I had thought that there was no need to mention it again. I didn't believe in committing to one person for the rest of one's life. At the rate people change, I didn't find it practical. Our relationship was ever more altered on a humid April morning on Reunion Island. Byron had insisted on waking up early and taking a walk to the beach while it was still empty. I wanted to lie in, doze, and finish the book I was reading. He made bourbon vanilla tea and threw pillows at me, bribing me with how lovely the dawn view would be. I told him to go on his own. He promised a cappuccino and pain au chocolat on the walk down, and I acquiesced. Coffee and pastry in hand, gazing at the last of the sunrise, we sat on the still cool sand while the air around us swirled with something yet unfamiliar to us. There was a peculiar tension, an odd anxiety that I couldn't understand. I brushed it off, thinking I was just out of sorts because of the early rise. But it kept returning, nagging at my mood, like a pebble in a shoe. "I have something for you," he finally said, breaking the spell of awkwardness. Thank God, I thought. The unease was just about a small gift that he was hiding, figuring out how to give it to me. Secrecy was the thing making us uncomfortable. We weren't accustomed to it. I looked at his empty hands, then searched his lit-up eyes for clues. "I'm not sure you'll like it." "Well, that's a good start," I joked. He laughed out of nervousness, not at my wit. The pebble was back. Before I could make another attempt at banter, he reached into his board shorts pocket and brought out a small black box hinged with gold. He opened it to reveal an especially large diamond set in a ring. Suddenly, the carefully planned trip to the romantic island made sense. The candlelit dinners, the rose petal turn-downs. I was usually used to, and happy with, more prosaic accommodation. "I don't understand," I said. "Are you going to make me beg?" "I'd prefer it if you didn't." "So then, is that a yes?" "I'm not sure. It depends what you're asking." He shrugged, as if he wasn't asking me a question that would change our lives forever. "It's yours, the diamond, whether you want to marry me or not." I had never been one for jewelry. I didn't like the fuss of accessorizing. The same went for marriage. Byron knew all of this and was asking anyway. I couldn't tell if he was blatantly disregarding my preference or if he had simply decided that his need for me was greater than my disinclination. That was the moment the trouble started. It wasn't only the unwelcome proposal that had me worried. Worse still was that I had accepted. Despite the whirring of my cognitive dissonance, the tap-tap-tapping of better judgment against my skull, I agreed to marry Byron. I knew that if I turned him down, it would be the end of our relationship, and I wasn't ready for that. Perhaps not immediately, but eventually it would take its toll. What I didn't guess was that by consenting to his need over mine, it would have the same sad effect. The honeymoon, as they say, was over. He told me about the money that evening, after a day of stolen glances and tentative affection. I was ribbing him about the size of the diamond, asking if he had had to take a second bond out on his house, saying the only reason I agreed was the size of the stone. 1 carat smaller and I would have refused. That's when he told me that he was wealthy. I laughed, saying he could stop trying so hard now. I'd already said yes. He was forgetting that I knew him so well, I told him, and that I saw his pilled jerseys and threadbare underwear. Multimillionaires don't buy toilet paper in bulk, I laughed. But it turned out that they do. I had always known that his company was successful, but had no idea as to the extent. The superfluous funds he kept offshore alone was 100 times my entire investment portfolio. The idea of the money came as a warm shock. Not unpleasant, but not entirely pleasant either. The revelation, along with the proposal, made my head spin. I understood why he had kept it a secret, but I felt it was duplicitous nonetheless. At a time when you'd expect a couple to feel most intimate, I found our connection vulnerable, stripped away, an exposed wire. Emotionally, I had taken a decisive step backwards, away from Byron. Unfortunately, it turned out to be the first of many. The rest of our time on the island was spent trying to forget about the awkward engagement. Before, we spent leisurely days on the beach, drank Le Dodo beer in the sun, ate our body weight in ham and cheese galettes and Nutella crepes, and had lazy afternoon sex. After, we took a helicopter ride over the volcano in the 3 cirques, went paragliding, and kept busy conscientiously taking our way through the travel guide's list of must-dos. The diamond was relentless in its glinting. When we arrived home and settled back into our regular routine, the money was a constant intruder on my thoughts. Not always unwelcome, but ever-present. I knew from reading articles on lottery winners that such a vast amount of unearned money could be destructive. I refused to be married in community of property, and insisted that we keep our accounts separate. I was a feminist, after all. Byron wanted me to have it all and more. Despite giving a significant amount away, he found he always had too much. Like me, he wasn't a great spender. I didn't need it either, I told him, and he laughed. Asked me what the opposite of a gold digger was, and when I said I didn't know, he said whatever it was, I was that. Before we had left for reunion, he had his private banker add me as a beneficiary to his current account, and named me as the sole beneficiary in his will. I now had a credit card that I never had to pay off. It was at first disconcerting. I kept thinking that I would have to pay it off somehow. Then surprisingly liberating. I no longer stood at a shop shelf and compared products versus prices. If I couldn't decide between the barista pinotage, 129 Rand, or the chocolate block, 168 Rand, I would just buy them both. I no longer questioned if we really needed a wedge of imported camembert. If I thought we would enjoy it, I bought it. When I saw someone in the queue that looked like they could do with a lucky break, I paid for their, usually, humble basket of groceries. There was a certain freedom in it, and I began to enjoy the small day-to-day luxuries that it afforded. I would also get a kick out of the restraint I showed, looking down at my trolley and seeing the camembert wrapped in its soft foil and thinking, I have over 30 million rand in the bank today, and I bought a bit of cheese. The funny thing about the money in the beginning was that although it made no exceptional difference to my everyday life, it felt like it did. I was hardly spending more money than I used to, but I felt rich. I felt a freedom that I had never experienced before, and a security, like a weight I never knew I had was lifted off my shoulders. It was like walking around with a warm secret. Being wealthy, I thought, was more a state of mind than a fat wallet. Gradually, my reluctance waned. A few years on, I couldn't remember why I had resisted the fortune at all. If anything, I thought I had grown to deserve it by putting up with Byron's moods. Our relationship, as I predicted, had deteriorated. We had a good few years after the wedding I never wanted, but each year hence seemed less satisfying than the one before it. We tried to buoy it by travelling together, and that worked for a while. It worked for a cycling trip through Brittany, a walk in Cambodia, and a swim in Chengdu. On the good days, it felt like we had reconnected for good. It worked less well for Christmas in New York, a beach holiday in Thailand, and a cruise to Iceland, and our holiday in Venice was a disaster. One occasion sums the trip up. After getting lost over and over again, Byron submitted to his sore feet and to his fury, and sat on a bench not to speak or be spoken to for over an hour, while I had no choice but to hover nearby until his darkness had passed. I had to learn when I could talk to him and when I couldn't. When he was in a good mood, he was his old, funny, charming self. He would spoil me with flowers and chocolate and put on music and sling me around the kitchen in a happy dance. We would plan our next holiday, poring over our travel books and Google. We'd drink expensive Merlot, and he'd kiss me on the lips and surprise me in the shower. These are the times I could relax and be myself. I didn't have to consider every word before I said it out loud. But these moments became more infrequent the longer our relationship progressed. Towards the end, his moods dominated our every interaction. Our house seemed to be carpeted with eggshells. I had to tread accordingly or face his anger, or worse, his contempt. Our relationship had become complicated. You'd be forgiven for thinking, as an outsider, that the problem was the power in the relationship had shifted to Byron. In fact, the opposite was true. Despite the marriage and the money, all the power was mine for a simple reason. Byron loved me more than I loved him. I realized this when he proposed, and I didn't have the heart to break his. This started as a small struggle, a gentle push and pull. But over time it became a tug of war. I knew it, he felt it, and it was to be our sad and slow undoing. What do you do with a man who loves you too much? I knew leaving would destroy him. If I even hinted at it, he would become desperate. He would have anxiety attacks, skip work, drink too much, as if to show me that he couldn't live without me. One particularly dark night, convinced that I was ending the relationship, he threatened suicide. He had a gun, he said, and pills. He had neither. He couldn't live without me. Wouldn't. I couldn't live this loitering life, my actions dependent on his state of mind. I refused to live in the ripples of his discontent. I still loved him, but the situation had become untenable. It was getting messy, and I don't like mess. I needed an exit plan. One that was as painless as possible for both of us. I loved him too much to leave him, to break his heart. I knew that I now depended on his money. Before meeting him, I was entirely self-sufficient. But since then, I had let my career slide, no longer worrying about cash flow, and only taking the jobs that excited me. I couldn't leave the money behind. Gradually, and without me realizing it, My perceived financial freedom had become a gilded cage. It's not like I sat down one day with a notebook and thought of ways to get rid of him. Killing him didn't cross my mind. Until it did. Once it was in my head, it seemed like the only thing to do. The compassionate thing to do. I would put him out of his suffering. I would do it because I loved him. Even most beloved pets, I reasoned, were put down when the time came. One morning he snapped at me for asking what we should have for dinner. He was getting ready for a meeting, removing lint from his jacket. "I can't think about that now," he barked. It was clear, I thought, that his time had come. Even after I had decided what to do, it took me a long time to action it. It was as if killing him was just a fantasy I would retreat to in times of strife. Something I would imagine at great length but never really do. I'd become one of those old ladies with purple rinsed hair and rheumy eyes, forever fixated on the life they should have lived. Of course I wouldn't actually kill him, I told myself. But I knew, deep down, that it was a lie. Still, I did nothing, as if waiting for one day when I would conveniently find him on the edge of a cliff, where I could give him a quick shove while no one was watching. I couldn't plan something, I thought. It would seem heartless, ruthless. An opportunity would have to present itself. This was perhaps a way of putting it off. Maybe, I thought, I didn't have the courage of my convictions. I found the box of papers one day while spring cleaning the house. You'd think with all the money that I'd pay someone to do the job, but I like to do it myself. It gave me immense satisfaction to unpack an entire room and to clean and declutter it. Once a year, I would take a week off work and tick off a room a day. This time, I found the job slightly less satisfying as the rooms were neat and organized to begin with, and, with 2 days to spare, I decided to attack the space beneath the house. It's an old house, built over 200 years ago, and while we have made superficial renovations, the core structure has remained the same. At the back of the house there is a small grey wooden door, weathered to the point of crumbling, which is the entry to the small storage space. How a child would love this hobbit-sized door, I thought, as I crept in and began clearing it out. There were to be no children in our future. It was not all to be thrown away. The dry firewood, laced with spiderwebs, would make excellent fuel for our brazier. Some terracotta pots would do well in our herb garden. There were some lovely old mason jars that we could use in our country-style kitchen. I even kept a sheet of newspaper, finding it quaint, thinking I would have it framed. The most interesting thing I found, however, was a small, ancient-looking clamshell box, dusty black, around the same size as a pack of cigarettes. As I opened it, I couldn't help remembering that day on the beach, and the diamond, which still flashed on my finger. The box held a sheaf of thin, off-white papers that I first took to be cigarette rolling papers. On closer inspection of the inside of the lid, however, I found a faint stamp, a company logo, a Victorian-era pharmacy, and I knew then how I would kill Byron. The box seemed to me a gift from fate, the reversal of the original awkward proposal. I enjoyed the aptness of the solution. Sometimes there is poetry in neatness. I waited till I was alone in the house, then placed one of the delicate papers on a saucer and poured some water over it. After letting it soak for a few hours, I strained the water into an old perfume bottle of mine and discarded the paper. The box of flypapers found refuge in my underwear drawer. Poisoning your husband is like falling asleep. It happens really slowly, and then all at once. Byron never seemed to notice the drops I added to his tea. I came to understand why arsenic was regarded as a tonic in the old days. His eyes became brighter, his cheeks ruddy. Friends commented on his seemingly good health. He complained of some muscle pain, and his stomach gave him trouble. I started it almost as an experiment, not sure if I would go through with the whole thing. I wasn't at all convinced that I would be able to do it. I gave him the minutest of doses and closely monitored his reaction. Worried that someone would find the pharmacy box, I threw it away, out of the window on a highway. I kept the flypapers hidden between pages of my novels. A story within a story. One night it was particularly bad, and I noted to dial it back a little. I couldn't stand to see him in pain. At my insistence, he saw a doctor, was diagnosed with gastroenteritis, and was told to take some time off work and drink plenty of fluids to stay hydrated. He assured the doctor that I made him endless cups of tea. Over time, the body builds a resistance to arsenic. I had to stop being coy, stop teasing him with it, and get it over with. There was a delicate balance to be observed. I had to do it slowly enough for it to not look suspicious. But at the same time, there had to be, at some point, a decisive dose. The whole point, after all, was to avoid suffering. I procrastinated until the day he brought in the rat. He had a headache and seemed confused, so I sent him into the garden to read his newspaper while I was preparing a cold chicken salad for lunch. I looked up from carving the bird and screamed. Just outside the kitchen window, Byron was standing, staring at me with his shining eyes, holding a dead rat up by its tail. I gripped the handle of the butcher knife, wondering if I would have to use it. He just wanted to show me, he said. Had I put any rodent poison down? It looks like his stomach exploded, he said. From then on, I stopped disposing of the leached flypapers in the compost bin. A day soon after that, Byron fell ill and had to stay in bed. He could afford the time off. Money kept pouring into our account. I was sitting at his bedside, reading a book. Unsuspecting, he said, his face flushed with fever. I asked him to repeat himself. Unsuspecting, he said again, and my heart accelerated. Did he know? The unsuspecting gold digger, he said. You know, how we described you. As whatever the opposite of a gold digger was. Or unwitting, I tried. Reluctant? No, he shook his head. Unsuspecting. It's gold, after all. The next day, Byron was dead. One moment he had light in his eyes. The next, it was gone. He had a heart attack, brought on, guessed his doctor, by stress. The damage to the heart was clear. There was no need for an autopsy. At the funeral, people tut-tutted that success does have its price, and when would we learn to not work so hard? At least there weren't any children, others whispered. I got home that evening as the storm clouds were gathering. I was glad for the thunder. The house was too quiet without him. Unsettling. I emptied the arsenic water down the drain, double-bagged the perfume bottle and smashed the glass with the meat mallet before throwing it in the neighbor's bin. I stripped off my plain black dress, heels, and stockings. I left my diamond ring on. I soaked in a hot bath while the rain pummeled the roof. The lights flickered a few times, as they do in houses as old as ours. The water soothed my aching feet. I wasn't used to wearing heels. Like I said, I've always been a practical person. I climbed into bed exhausted, as if I'd been awake for years and it was finally time to allow my eyes to close. I swapped my pillow with one that was still scented by Byron, and the lights flickered some more. I checked my bank balance on my phone and then reached for my paperback. It was the same every night. Bath, silk pajamas, bed, bank balance, book. It was a ritual that almost always ensured sound sleep. I opened the novel and the delicate bookmark fluttered out, the last flypaper. I picked it up and dropped it almost immediately, as if it had given me an electric shock. Inscribed on it, in blue ballpoint, was unmistakably Byron's handwriting. It said, I forgive you. The end.